Archaeology porn.
So, following on from our visit to early medieval Britain last week in the Game of Thrones episode, we are going to focus today's archaeology porn on a really hot number from that time period. And I know I usually like to diversify my content, but given that we just covered that and that I just visited this thing, I thought we should stay on the time period. And what is it that I just saw and just visited? That would be the Alfred Jewel. So what is the Alfred Jewel? It's an amazingly extravagant piece of early medieval British jewelry, which incorporates a lot of those techniques we discussed when we went over the Staffordshire hoard. So first, we have gold filigree. Now, if you remember, that's an incredibly painstaking process of soldering together tiny gold or silver beads and wire to create these very, very intricate and delicate designs like this here. And there you see some of that filigree on the side of the Alfred Jewel. Second, there's cloisonné, fancy French word. Now, what's that? Remember, that's the pressing down of enamel or stones in between gold or silver borders. And that's what's used to create this effect on the face of the jewel. If you recall, that's exactly what we saw in the Staffordshire hoard and also the Sutton Hoo burial treasures with all those garnets that are inlaid in the gold. That's cloisonné. And thirdly, we have, of course, all of these animal motifs. And in this case here, it's actually a mythical animal.
Pop the magic dragon lived by the sea.
Yep, that's right. It's a dragon. And we did see dragons or dragon-like creatures too in the Staffordshire hoard, like this one right here. And who could forget that belt buckle from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which, in addition to having animal motifs hidden all over it, is really just a giant dragon's head. And perhaps the most famous piece from the Sutton Hoo ship burial, that helmet. If you look closely, you'll see the wings of the dragon or his eyebrows. The head of the dragon is somewhere up, by his forehead, and I suppose that's the tail of the dragon there, his mustache. And there are two other features which we haven't seen much of yet. First, protecting that enamel face is a tear-shaped quartz crystal, which we did not see in the Staffordshire hoard, and this is really what has protected the Alfred Jewel and kept it in its current state. And secondly, if you remember, there's almost nothing inscribed, no inscriptions in the Staffordshire hoard, which is one of the reasons it's so mysterious. All we had was that one measly inscription, which was a Bible verse. It was from a psalm. So there's not anything to really provenance the hoard, which is why it's such a mystery. Well, helpfully, the Alfred Jewel has a big old inscription on it, and we're going to get to that in a second because it's an important clue as to what this thing actually is. Now, before we get to the interpretation of this hot bit of archaeology porn, how did it actually come down to us? Well, it's pretty simple. It was plowed up in an agricultural field near Petherton Park, which is in County Somerset in the southwest of England. And that happened way back in 1693. Now, it was donated soon thereafter to the Oxford University, and then it eventually came down to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which to my mind is probably the second best museum in England behind the British Museum. If you recall from our site visit to Knossos, the guy who led that excavation, Arthur Evans, well, he was actually the director of the Ashmolean Museum, so there's a connection there. Now, what is this Alfred Jewel? Where did it come from? What does it mean? Well, unlike the Staffordshire hoard, there's actually a lot of good evidence for this one, so we don't really need to get too sciencey or into too much complex detective work.
No Sherlock.
First, let's start with the obvious. What does that inscription say? It says, Alfred Mechech Berkan, and I'm sorry I don't speak Old English, so sorry for that pronunciation to you aficionados out there. But anyway, in today's language, that means Alfred ordered me made. So who would this Alfred be? You guessed it, that would be Alfred the frickin' Great.
A day we make the pagans wish they had never heard of Wessex. Today, we fight for Wessex.
And why might Alfred have had this made? Well, here we can practice some good historical archaeology. So, as shown here in The Last Kingdom, that hit show from a few years ago, and that's where I'm getting the footage, Alfred, in addition to being a great war leader, was a great patron of learning. And he insisted that not only the clergy, but also the elites in society should be literate. Prior to this, they were mostly illiterate, preferring to let their nerdy scribes do all the reading and writing for them. And so, unlike a lot of other kings of this period, we actually have a lot of written stuff from Alfred's court and reign. We have laws, charters, correspondence, and of course the life of Alfred, which was a very sensationalized and favorable biography written about Alfred by his counselor, a Welsh monk named Asser. Now, one of the things that Alfred did to promote learning around the kingdom, which, remember, learning and teaching was almost exclusively through the church at this point, was he translated copies of Pope Gregory's book on pastoral care and sent them around to the churches in England. And what pastoral care did was it taught people the responsibilities of being a clergy at this time. So this was a twofer. It was not only sort of sending a book around that was in high Latin and teaching it to people in English, but it was also helping the clergy to be better Christians and better at their responsibilities. Because, remember, at this time, we still had plenty of drunken monks, priests, and bishops who didn't know shit and were basically just put in their positions because of their connection.
Oh!
They were the lesser children of nobility in many cases. And who was this Pope Gregory? Well, he actually lived a long time before this, in the 6th century, so 300 some odd years before this. And he was actually the same pope that sent that mission to re-Christianize England after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Anyway, in his preface to the book, and I guess copies of that still survive, or maybe some of the originals, Alfred did put a little note, and I'm going to have to read this. He wrote, "And I will send a copy to every bishop's see in my kingdom, and in each book there is an aestel of 50 mancuses, and I command in God's name that no man take the staff from the book, nor the book from the church." So what exactly does that mean? I'm going to have to translate two key terms here. First, a mancus was a standardized weight of gold coin, which was actually equivalent to an Arab gold dinar. Remember, there actually was international trade at this time, and we saw that in the Sutton Hoo burial and other goods from the time. Now, fun fact, prior to this, there were actually gold coins in England that were found to have bastardized Arabic on them. One of these came from the reign of King Offa from the kingdom of Mercia, and I think this was about 100 years before Alfred the Great. Now, this coin that you're seeing, on one side it says Offa Rex, which means Offa, king, and on the other side there's actually the Muslim declaration of faith in poorly written Arabic, and it says, "There is no God but Allah alone." Wow, if only these Christians knew what they put on their coins. Anyway, I got off track. Let's return to the Alfred Jewel. So Alfred's preface says he's sending this book on pastoral care to all the bishoprics in England, along with an aestel of 50 mancuses. And those 50 mancuses, well, that would be a goodly value in that time. Probably, a few months' salary for a skilled craftsman or other profession in that day and age. And that this aestel or staff is not to be removed from the book, and the book is not to be removed from the churches. But what is an aestel? Well, an aestel can mean a few different things. It can mean a guide, it can mean an index, but in this particular context, it probably means a pointer. You see, in this day and age, of course, books were written and illuminated by hand, a long, painstaking, and expensive process. So, in order to protect the books, people read with a pointer as not to smudge the ink with their nasty fingers. And actually, this practice exists still today. You see, we Jews, we have our holy book called the Torah, and that is still a big scroll which is written by hand. So we use pointers, or called a yad in Hebrew, to read the Bible each week, and that's what you're seeing here. And if we look at the Alfred Jewel, we can even see the little slot where the pointer, probably made of some kind of bone like ivory, would have fit right in. And although the Alfred Jewel is definitely the most elaborate surviving example, there were a few other objects that look just like this and probably served the same purpose from Anglo-Saxon England. Now, there's one other fun factoid that ties this to Alfred as well, and that is the find site at Petherton Park. Now, that place is less than 10 miles away from Athelney, which is that swampy area where Alfred hid out and led his successful guerrilla campaign against the Vikings, thereby saving England's independence and sort of forging the nation. Now, unfortunately, if you go there today, Athelney, all you see is this stupid monument. And we have Henry VIII to thank for that, because he, of course, led the destruction and the dissolution of the monasteries, among those Alfred's monastery at Athelney, which was probably broken up and sold for scrap stone, a very inglorious end. However, this site was the very first site on Time Team, my favorite archaeological show ever. So, in sum, just about everything about the Alfred Jewel screams Alfred the Great. But what is the image on there? Who is this dude? Who does it represent? Well, for this, other contemporaneous artifacts do give us some hints. Now recall, Alfred was all about learning.
Nerds! Nerds! Nerds!
And he figured you needed all 5 senses to learn, but chief among these, of course, was sight, which you needed for reading. There was no Braille at that time, and he called that the mind's eye. Now, this concept is expressed on other high-status objects of the time, but the most elaborate of these is found in the British Museum, and that is the Fuller Brooch. Now, the Fuller Brooch shows the 4 supporting senses for learning: taste, hearing, smell, and touch, around the center of the brooch, where we find the primary sense for learning, sight. And it's believed that perhaps that figure on the Alfred Jewel with the big eyes, well, that represents the same thing we find at the center of the Fuller Brooch, that figure for sight. So that's all pretty clear, right? We're done here. Well, not exactly. There are probably 2 outstanding issues that are not totally done and dusted. First, there's that inscription, Alfred ordered me made. Well, at this era of very strict social hierarchy, it's kind of odd not to have Rex next to Alfred, Alfred the King. After all, this was not a day and age where we called our leaders Bill, George, Joe, or Donald. However, the preponderance of the evidence is so strong in linking this to Alfred the Great that I think even though the inscription doesn't have Rex with it, I'd be willing to bet that that's exactly who this is talking about. But that still leaves the figure on the face of the Alfred Jewel. As I've suggested, it could represent sight, but it also could be Christ as well, because in early Christian times, where we are right now, there was a very common depiction of Christ called Christ in Majesty, which shows him holding a book. And for that reason, it's often used to connote wisdom or enlightenment. And it makes sense that that would be sort of the figure chosen if Alfred was sending around a book meant to teach people and, that they could learn. However, there has been some recent speculation that that figure actually represents Alexander the Great. Now, I know that sounds far-fetched, but hear me out. I actually think it is plausible. You see, in this early Middle Ages, early medieval times, even though the memory of antiquity and learning of the classics was largely forgotten, only to be revived later in the Renaissance period, people at this time still did idolize Alexander the Great as the consummate warrior king. And there are many versions of a particular story about him, which of course is not true. It's a legend or a myth. And even though Alexander the Great was definitely a historical figure, of course, after he died very young, there were lots of these kind of tall tales that sprung up about him. Well, in a quest to see the whole world which he had conquered, Alexander the Great wanted to see it from above, the whole world. So he harnessed 2 griffins or large birds, and actually to coax them higher, he held skewers of meat above their head so they would just keep flying up to grab that meat. So those 2 things in his hands, those could either be the harnesses to hold the birds, or they could be the skewers to coax them to fly higher. And this particular image was not uncommon in medieval times. You could find it in Europe. You could find it even in the Middle East. And this picture here, that's an example from a church in southern Italy. However, regardless of who the figure actually represents, whether it be Sight personified, Christ in majesty, or Alexander the Great harnessing a bunch of big birds, the message is still really the same. The purpose of this is wisdom, it's knowledge. That's exactly what Alfred was doing in sending this translation of pastoral care all around England. So here we've used the contemporary material record, art history, historical archaeology, and pretty much good old-fashioned common sense to help us to figure out what this Alfred Jewel actually was. But one thing that's certain and completely indisputable, this is a lurid example of hot archaeology porn. And that's a wrap. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.